So my wife and I, before we met, wanted different things in our future relationship, and God ignored it. In fact, he gave us the opposite. So let me explain. Before I met my wife, I was 18. I was living on my own. I was living with my buddy and his dad in their apartment. So it was like three bachelors, right? We were all living in an apartment, but I was on my own from, being home. I wasn't home anymore. And I had never really been in a serious relationship. I've been in, I dated throughout high school, but I wouldn't say that they were like super serious. And I had kind of basically put it in my head that I didn't want to have kids, or especially I didn't want to raise someone else's kids. And the reason for this is that I was the oldest of 5 kids in my household. And I was the oldest and only boy. So a lot of the responsibility in my household fell to me. My sisters, my stepsister's 5 years younger than me. And then my closest half sister is 10 years, and then 11, and then 12. So there's a decent gap between me and my sisters. And my stepsister, I love her, but she didn't really live with us. She would come and stay with us for a certain amount of time and then go back. So she was in our house off and on throughout the years. But my half sisters obviously grew up in the household with me. But my dad treated my half sisters and my stepsister way different than he treated me. He was much tougher on me. And because I was the oldest, I had pretty much all the responsibility. And, I resented him for that for a long time. But that's a separate video. The point out of that is, because I had to do everything, I basically raised my sisters. Both of my parents worked full time. My mom worked days and my dad worked nights, and they just alternated. So if they were home, they were either sleeping or kind of catching up on things around the house, in their spare time, or working on a hobby or something. So they would just kind of they'd come home, they'd sleep, they'd sequester themselves away doing something, and then they would go back to work. And they just kind of repeated the cycle throughout pretty much my entire, adolescent life. And because of this, I basically raised my sisters. I would have to go to school, and then I would come home, and I'd have to, get them from school, and then I'd have to come and do, the chores around the house, and then my homework, and I'd have to make dinner, and I would have to do that day after day after day. And then on the weekends, I spent most of my weekends cleaning, the house, or doing the yard, or, doing whatever around the house. And so I really didn't have much of a social life. So because of all of this, raising my sisters, I basically, when I became 18 and I moved out, I was like, I'm done raising kids that aren't mine. I'm done, being around that. I don't want to deal with kids anymore. I just spent, 10 plus years raising kids that weren't even mine. So I just don't ever want to do that. Now I'm going to pivot real quick. So my wife at the time was separated from her ex. She was married. She was separated. There was a lot of issues between them, cheating, just a lot of negativity, hostility, just not very good. And my wife at the time already had 3 kids. Before we met, she had 3 kids. And she basically, when they separated, she wanted to be with someone, but she specifically didn't want to be with someone who was younger than her. And I think this is because she dated a few guys in between the time that she left her ex and the time that she met me. And, some of them were younger, and a lot of younger guys are immature. And I understand it. Obviously, that's probably pretty accurate. And so she didn't want someone who was younger because she didn't want someone who was, immature. She wanted to be with someone around her age, and I think she was 23 at the time. So I was 18, she was 23. We're about 4.5 years apart. And she was like, I just don't want someone who's younger than me. And here's the thing. We both had these expectations. Oh, she also didn't want someone younger than her because she wanted to be able to drink, go to bars. So my wife at the time, she grew up Christian, but she was backslid. So she was drinking, partying, smoking, and just kind of doing stuff that is not good, right? And not just not Christian good, just not good in general. So she was drinking till she was blackout drunk. She was just going out all the time. Just not good. And she basically didn't want to get with someone who was going to be younger than her because she didn't want to have to change her lifestyle. Basically, she wanted to be able to continue this destructive lifestyle, but also she wanted someone who was mature enough that they wouldn't, basically be a child, which I understand. So anyway, So just keep this in mind. So I met my wife. I met her in April of 2006. And I say that because it's kind of important, but it's not. So we met in 2006 in April. And basically she had stopped by our apartment because her best friend was dating my roommate. And so they were all going to go bowling, and they basically stopped by the apartment to pick some stuff up. And while they were there, they saw me, and she asked if I wanted to go with them bowling. Initially, I declined, but then I was like, you know what, I'm not really doing anything here anyway, so I guess I'll go. So I just decided to go. And throughout the night, she was hitting on me. She really did like me. And obviously, I'm just the most charismatic person you've ever met. So she was instantly drawn to my charisma, I guess. I rizzed her up, I suppose. And so she really liked me. We hit it off. And she, told me right off the bat, the very first night, she's like, listen, if this goes any further, I just want you to know that I'm not looking for a dad for my kids. I was like, okay, that's cool, whatever. It did throw me off that she had 3 kids, right? But I was like, okay, whatever. I just kind of internalized it, but didn't really think much of it. Well, at the same time, she asked how old I was. Now, I already knew if I told her I was 18, because she told me she was 23, that if I said I was 18, I would sound young, right? Like fresh out of high school or something, which technically I was. But I told her I was 19. And it seems so dumb now and insignificant. However, if you really think about it, it's not that dumb. Like, it makes sense to kind of like age up a little bit so that you don't seem like a kid. And it's exactly what she was trying to avoid. But I didn't know that. So I was like, oh, I'm 19. She's like, oh, okay. So I think she didn't like it, but she was like, oh, I mean, I guess it's not that much, right? So anyway, so we hit it off. And here's the thing. My wife grew up Christian, like I said, and when she was kind of at the bottom, she kind of hit rock bottom right before she met me, because she had tried to date other guys. They weren't working out. They were immature or weird or whatever. She obviously wasn't working out with her ex because he actually left for another woman, and she was stuck with these kids. And she just was at her wit's end. And she prayed to God that he would bring somebody to her that was not younger and would allow her that wouldn't try to change her, basically. Well, ultimately, when we got together, that's the opposite of what happened, right? I obviously was younger, but also I didn't really drink and smoke. So I did a little bit, right? If people had beers, I would have some, or if they had, cigarettes, I smoked for a little bit, but I just thought I was kind of dumb, so I stopped. But anyway, I just didn't really do any of that. And so, when we got together, I didn't do that. And she slowly didn't do it as much. And she realized it. She's like, wow, I wanted to do all these things, but when I'm with you, I just don't want to. Now, contrast that to what I was going through. What I was thinking when we first got together, and I mentioned this in the previous video, that I didn't even know if I wanted to stay with her because she had kids. So coming up in the background that I did, where I basically raised my siblings, and knowing that I didn't want to be with someone with kids because I didn't want to go through that again, knowing she had the 3 kids, I struggled with that. I struggled with this idea of raising someone else's kids after I just spent a lot of my life doing that. And I told her that. I was like, listen, I'm not sure how I feel about this. And we still just kept talking, and we still kept meeting up just to kind of, see where it would go. And like I mentioned in my last video, I think that God used this guy named Felipe to really kind of help me get my priorities focused, because I told him what I was going through. I was like, listen, she's got kids, and I don't know if I want to do that. And he's like, well, do you like her? And I was like, yeah, I really like her. Like, we have a lot of shared interests, and we get along really well. We actually have a lot of fun together. Her humor is like mine. And, we seem to click really well. And he's like, well, then why does that? He's like, then you should just go with it and see where it goes. Like, why are you letting this thing that, may or may not affect it, come into that? She even said she's not looking for a father. And I was like, okay, you know what? You're right. I'll just go all in, and we'll see where this goes. And we did. Like, I moved in with her. She was moving into a new apartment, and the situation in my current apartment with my buddy and his dad was getting kind of weird. He was a weird guy. He drank a lot. Just not a good situation. But anyway, she was moving, and I was like, you know what? I'll just move in with you. I'll help you pay your rent, and we'll see how this goes. And if it doesn't work out, then I'll move out. I'll get my own place, and, no issue. Like, it's fine. And she agreed. And so I moved in with her, and ultimately we made it work. Like, she did change, but I also learned to love her kids. And then we both accepted Jesus and got baptized within the next year or two. And then we got married. And there's a lot, obviously a lot more in that situation. But ultimately, the point out of all this is that we both knew what we wanted before we even got in the relationship. I said, I don't want someone with kids. I don't even want kids because I don't want to go through that again. She said, I don't want someone younger than me because I don't want to change my lifestyle, and I don't want someone who's immature. And guess what? We ended up getting together, and it was the opposite of what we asked for. And I say that this is all God because the way that I was looking at it at the time was a punishment to raise the kids, to raise my sisters. Like, it was a burden, and it was in a way, but it wasn't a burden in the fact that nothing good came out of it. In fact, me raising my sisters helped prepare me for meeting my wife and raising her kids. So if I had not been through the situation with my sisters before I met my wife, I would not be prepared to help raise kids that weren't mine. So God used that situation. But in reverse too, you see, my wife didn't want someone who was younger and who was, maybe a little more pliable, like a little more open and honest and, not so jaded or, set in their ways or, that was also just, I guess I would say a little more innocent, but in the way that, I wasn't a jerk. I wasn't just out, shopping around or just there to mess around. Like, I was fine being with her. And I also didn't do a lot of those things that she did. So it changed her over time for the better. And yes, I was a little immature. Okay. I tried to drift and wreck my car, not just once, but twice. And, I did do a few things that were kind of immature, right? But after those things, I actually did mature a little bit. But I think even mature people can still make mistakes or make stupid decisions that, they are affected by. So, whatever. Ultimately, the point is that, sometimes we don't want certain things because we think that, that's just not what's best for us. But God knows better. And the whole point of this whole video is that God knows better than we do. And so ultimately, we should be submitting these things to God. God, what do you want to do in this situation? If I had been praying about it, maybe God would have spoke to me back then, but I didn't really know God then. And if my wife had been listening to God instead of just telling him, hey, here's what I want as a checklist, then sometimes, maybe she would have heard from God. I don't know. But God knew what was best for us, and he put us together anyway. And I guess the ultimate thing to take away from this is that God can use anybody's past and the things that you've been through for the future, for the betterment of maybe yourself or the people around you. All of the stuff that has happened to us, there are a lot of bad things that happen to good people. Okay. None of us, I think, can just ignore that there are a lot of bad things that happen to people that don't deserve those things to happen to them. But the enemy wants you to feel like you're isolated in it, that you're a victim, that you can never get over those things, or even worse, that thing that happened to you will keep you trapped in some kind of cycle, some kind of burden, some kind of bondage where you can't use that for a greater glory. But that's not the truth. The truth is that God can use any situation that you've been through for a better situation. In fact, if you use what you've been through and not internalize it, but externalize it and use it for a greater good, you can actually make positive impact and positive change. So if I had just used that thing of, I was a victim because my parents made me raise my sisters and now I'll never take on kids, I never would have stayed with my wife. I never would have had my son, and I never would have taken in the 3 girls that we also have on top of that, because I wouldn't have been a father. I wouldn't have been a good father. I wouldn't have chosen to accept, hey, I went through this thing, but now I can use it for good. So I don't know. Ultimately, I guess that's the end of the video. I don't know if it makes sense. Sometimes I just go on these rants and I'm like, I don't even know what the heck I'm talking about. So if you made it this far, thanks. I don't know what to say. You can leave a comment or something. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. God bless. Bye.